here this morning, especially after a week of Bible school. I said, actually, I know it'll shock you that at the end of one night I actually had rug burns on my knees from the one night it was raining and from playing games up in the parlor at the Dorsey Church and chasing kids around. The next morning I went to the gym and I was working out and kind of started to sweat a little bit. I wondered why my knees burned so dang bad. And I looked down, they weren't real big. They wasn't real easy to see, but you could see little rug burns where I've been crawling around on my knees with the kids. And I went, okay, Lord, I got it. But having the kids, everything happens for a reason. And I don't know about you, but I sort of sometimes react that way, like everything happens for a reason. You gotta be kidding me. Or maybe the other side is true. Maybe that's how you're reacting, because I'm telling you, maybe everything doesn't happen for a reason. And you're going, I don't like that either, because it feels comforting at times to know everything happens for a reason. Well, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on that feeling comfortable for a minute. If I asked one of you to come up here and stand on the railing. Now, I know the older folks in the church are going, God will be really upset if they stand on the altar rail. But, and I don't know that. He may be, when I get to heaven, then God may look at me and go, why don't you let those people stand on the altar rail? But I mean, particularly because I always, because Jeff and I are so closely attached, I always could talk about Jeff, and I know. But I could bring Jeff up here and I could stand him on the altar rail. And I can see by the look in his eye now that, and Jeff's like 6'2", 3", whatever, I don't know. Jeff's a lot bigger than I am. He's a big guy. That's a lot of body to be this high off the ground. And I'm guessing, I can see that look. He isn't too excited about coming up here and standing on that rail. So I'm not going to make him, but if he were standing there and I went up and just shoved him and knocked him down on top of the bench, then according to this, doesn't matter. Everything happens for a reason. And you go, but no, Rick, no, that's different. No. If everything happens for a reason, then me pushing him off the railing, then that was part of God's plan, right? For those who buy into strict Calvinism, that's part of God's plan.
I don't think so.
No? Do you want to try?
Well, I wouldn't mind, but he's too big.
But he's too big, okay. But that's, and that was sort of a bit of a challenge. And I just thought, sometimes these things, like last Sunday we talked about faith fixes everything. Well, faith doesn't fix everything. You can have faith and still get sick. You can have faith and still fail a test in school. You can have faith and still end up with me as your pastor. Maybe that's it. But Larry Osborne, he tells a story at the beginning of this chapter, and he talks about when his wife got cancer. And he said he describes many well-meaning people who are coming up to him with these types of statements. And Osborne says, they would say things like, well, God must be up to something, because God doesn't make mistakes. He says, you must be very special for God to trust you with this. I don't know if some of you have been through grief and some difficulty that maybe folks have said that. Wouldn't it be great to see how God uses this? Folks would say. And then they'd say, isn't it good to know that everything happens for a reason? And in one sense, they are actually right. No matter what happens, God is in control. But there's a difference in God being in control and God causing. He is the king of the universe. He is good. But that doesn't mean he is the direct cause of every problem. God doesn't necessarily do it. God didn't cause Lucifer to rebel and to be thrown out of heaven. God, as much as we would like to think, did not go to Eve and say, hey, I'm going to make you eat from that tree because I want to teach everybody else a lesson. You know what, I'm tired of you guys having it so easy in the garden here, and you've got it made, and you know what, I've just decided, I think the world needs to know how tough it really has to be. So I'm going to toughen you up, and Eve, you're going to go eat this apple, and you're going to make Adam do it too. That's the God I am. I'm guessing, and I'm pretty sure, for those of you who know the story of David, David went up on top, kind of had his binoculars, although they didn't really have those then, and he was checking out the rooftops, and there was Bathsheba, who was young and pretty good looking, and taking a bath on the roof up there where she thought she had privacy. And Bathsheba was David's general's wife, and David went after Bathsheba. I don't think that God said, hey David, I want you to have adultery with that woman, kill her husband, and go on, because I want to show the world what I can do. Oh yeah, that Tower of Babel thing? Oh yeah. Said, I want to build this big tower. I said, I want you all to worship God so then I can strike all your languages down and nobody will understand anybody anymore. We have to understand that these are the things that when we say everything happens for a reason, we've got to look beyond our little scope and go, gee, that makes me feel comfortable today, but in reality, it means I can bring Jeff up here and push him off the railing. Probably not, because he's bigger than I am and he'll just push me back. But we can do that. Did God go to the Romans and say, I want you to capture Jesus, I want you to whip him until he can hardly walk, and then I want you to crucify him? Or did God allow that because it is the nature of us being made in the image of God? Those who carry out the evil deeds bear full responsibility for their actions. They can't blame God. Adam tried it. Remember, Adam tried it. Hey, whoa, it's her fault. I wouldn't eat that if she hadn't made me do it. Just proved the first guy to blame the woman. Jeez, go figure. But when we come up with that kind of idea, that everything happens for a reason, the first feeling is like, okay, I'm telling myself God's in control. We're not denying that God's in control. But when you start thinking about it and you say everything happens for a reason, that means God caused that horrific event. That means God is causing the trouble in the Middle East. That means God is causing the poverty that our mission team is serving in Baltimore now. And there's a big difference in that. So where do we come up with such an idea? And I want you to see that it comes from that verse 28 in Romans 8. It comes from a combination of wishful thinking and kind of a twisted view of some of the verses in the Bible. In fact, Osborne says that this verse, Romans 8:28, is the most misquoted in all the Bible. He says that no other verse, he says it shows up on coffee mugs, it shows up on t-shirts, it shows up on anything. And if we read the King James, and this is where it comes from the King James. And the King James comes from Old English, not Hebrew or Greek, which was the original, and it was very poetic. And it says, and we know that all things work together for the good of them that love God. To them, all are called according to his purpose. Now, I'm going to go to the NIV, and I read the New Living, both of which translate more directly from the Greek. And the difference is small. You've got to look close. And we know that all things work together for good. And we know that, here's the key word. It's a preposition. In all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now think about that a second before you just reject what I say or accept what I say because you just believe everything I tell you anyway. Yeah, I figured that would come from somebody, and it would usually then incite others. And we know that all things work together. Wow, isn't that nice? All things work, they work together. That's real nice until you fall down and break a leg. How's that working together? Oh, God has a purpose for it. God will do something. God will make good out of it if, and there's two things that have to occur. One, we know in all things, God works for good. God's intent for nuclear energy was to air condition the church, heat the church in the wintertime, to create medicine for cancer, God's intent was not to wipe out all Japan. Even though, maybe in the long run, that worked out that less people died, whatever side of the war you follow and all that kind of stuff. But God's intent was not to create something so we could kill half the world off. That's not the nature of God. It just doesn't fit. So, we know that all things work together for those who love Him, and they're called according to His purpose. The King James was written in 1611. It was written in Elizabethan or Shakespearean, the English. And it might have had a clear translation. We have shown that language changes. If our grandparents had talked about, or maybe even us, our parents and us, if we talked about dope wasn't a real good thing. It either meant you weren't very bright or it was drug related. Now, if somebody's car is dope, it's an awesome car. It's a really good car. And some of you going, really? I didn't know that. Yeah, really, it is. Notice that difference. And we know that in all things, God works for good. That's what the difference was. Said Osborne he goes on, he says, if we live in a high-handed, in a disobedience, though, in the area of our lives, there's no blanket promise that God will step in and fix the mess that we create. And that comes from the very end of this verse. And it says, if we go here, works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Called according to His purpose. Those who assume that everything happens has God's fingerprints fail to distinguish between what God allows and what God causes. And there's a big difference. You know that as an individual. There are things that you allow that you may not like. And there are things that you cause, either to prevent that or to create a different situation. That is the difference. Some of this comes because we live in a fallen world, because Adam and Eve created a fallen world. That is the failures of being human. Sometimes bad things happen because this is not a perfect place. Sometimes it happens because it all started with Adam and Eve. And you go, oh, Rick, it can't be that simple. You don't have to like it. You don't have to believe it. And just because you don't believe it doesn't mean that it's not true. Any attempt to downplay the impact of the fall, according to Osborne, the assumption that Christians have a magic bubble of protection fails to square with the Scriptures, he says. Or with life. Murphy, under Murphy's Law, isn't God's emissary, he's Adam's legacy. He's a result of our lives. When it comes to consequences of the fall, we aren't offered immunity. We are offered eternity. There's a big difference. Sometimes, maybe some of you don't, but I think generally, sometimes some of us make foolish decisions. And foolish decisions sometimes are sinful ones. And sometimes they're just dumb decisions. You take it from somebody who 2 times before I painted the kitchen the way it is now. I picked a color that I sure would work, and I painted the kitchen, and I didn't like it. I kept painting, think I would. I did. I went back and I repainted the whole thing, and then I repainted the whole thing again with 3 different colors until I was happy. I made a bad decision. The consequence was I had to paint the kitchen 3 times. God did not save me from that event. That was my fault. That wasn't God's fault. You picked the wrong partner to be with in business. And you find out that this guy or gal starts cheating you. God didn't say, oh, I'm going to send this guy to steal your money from your business. You picked a bad partner. And you might have done everything right. It might have been a relative. More often than not. The good news is that God's promises to keep us from making the same lame decisions or to fix whatever we break really isn't going to change. He will, though, get us through those bad decisions. David is that example. You know, he didn't want David to have an affair. He didn't want David to do those things, but in the end, David became one of the greatest leaders in the Bible, but David suffered for it. You remember he and Bathsheba lost their first child? Yeah. There were consequences. That wasn't a punishment. That was just a consequence. I mean, let's think about it. Anybody, please don't raise your hand, but, in your family, has there been a big divorce? Your parents, your grandparents, you. Well, if everything happens for a reason, then what about Malachi 2 and verse 16, where God says, I hate divorce? What if you were abused as a child? So, was that good? Did it happen for a reason? Jesus said, but if anyone of these little ones who believes in me, if someone causes them to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Matthew 18:6. Those who pin every disease and financial disaster and betrayal and direct action on God, we're in an illogically indefensible position. We can't defend that. It doesn't match. It might have felt good for a second, but in reality, it just does not fit. Can God grow something good out of a bad situation? Yes. Several of us have sat together in very grieving situations. And we've talked about that. And our feeling is that if God is in control of everything, then God did that. God didn't cause these brand new candles to not work. This is the second or third week in a month. They're only a month old. It's a bad design. Somebody did that. There's something in the Romans 8 that a lot of people miss. That last part. It's not a promise for everyone. It's not even a promise for every Christian. It's a promise for a specific kind of person. And this is what becomes painful to some of us. And it says this. The person has to meet two criteria for all things to work for good. One, that person has to love God. Two, and has to be called according to his purpose. Now, we're called, but this called, when we translate it and breaks it out, means taking action. Means you have accepted Christ. Means you are living in Christ. You are going there. Now, it does not mean that all Christians will never have these bad things to occur. We know that. We're living proof. But if you want good to grow out of these disasters and realize that it just doesn't happen, God's not sitting there like Zeus throwing down lightning bolts saying, ha ha, I got you. You have to have an obedient lifestyle. Some Christians are even left out of this promise. If you're living as a Christian, but at this point in your life you're just in deliberate disobedience, not just that occasional sin, but you're just going, I don't really care what the Bible says. I don't buy that. I've made up my own mind. I'm going to go do this. God's not punishing you, but your decisions have consequences. David was a very, very faithful man. He was a great king, but he made some real bad decisions. I mean, you could do a TV show to show that I'm going to have an affair with somebody's wife. I said I'm going to give him an order to go to the front lines, and he gets killed. His husband gets killed at the front lines. God doesn't promise that he's going to step in every time and fix the mess that we created or somebody else has created. David was forgiven, and he was used by God to write Scripture. And yes, God brought some good things out of their union and their son Solomon. But all in all, David would have been a lot better off if he had never, ever seen that woman on the roof. Their firstborn, I said, died in infancy. David spent the rest of his life in war. David's entire time as a king was in war. His family was a dysfunctional mess. Nobody in here can testify for that, I'm sure. Joyce was saying at the beginning of church, she was saying something about him. None of which qualifies as God's plan. That was not God's plan. God's plan was for us to live in the Garden of Eden. That was God's plan. The beauty and the promise in Romans 8 is not that bad things will eventually prove to be a good thing. Because you know what? Some bad things don't end up being a good thing. Some of them just end up being bad things. They just do. But God's ultimate and eternal purpose for us and in our lives is for those who love Him and are called according to Him, that ultimately we won't be foiled. David wasn't foiled. We are here today. Jesus, son of David. David is important, but David's personal life suffered some real tough things. Tim Keller, a writer and author, points out that there is no place in the Bible that teaches us that bad things are really blessings in disguise, or that every cloud has a silver lining. You can't find it biblically. It sounds nice, but it's not there. Jesus is upset at the death of his friend Lazarus. You know why? Because Jesus hates death. He hates death because it separates us from our loved ones. He hates loneliness. He hates alienation. He hates pain. He hates suffering. But Keller says this, that Jesus hates it all so much that he is willing to come into this world and experience it all himself, so that eventually he could destroy death without destroying us. Keller said that Jesus didn't come to suffer so that we wouldn't. He came to suffer, and we suffer so we can become more like Him. It is obedience to Christ. It's obedience to Christ, not to the government, not to pop culture, not to our own intelligence. Yeah, but you know, I don't believe that. And in our society, there is so much more of that, which is in our nature, created in God's image, that we want to play God. I don't like that part, Rick, so I don't accept it, and this is my belief. I'm not just blaming you. I'm not saying I don't do the same thing. Oh, but this can't be that bad. It says, for all who are called according to His purpose. For all who obey. This week, I want you to look closely at your life. And I want you to begin looking at what you think God allows versus what God cost. And then I want you to look at your own life and try to see how obedient you are to what God has said we're supposed to do. How close are we to allowing God to have that chair in the center of our lives? How close are we allowing Him to be in control, even though it's contrary to pop culture? That is why understanding theology, looking at our lives, or have we allowed watered down, non-biblical thoughts to become okay, and we think they're comforting, and yet in the end, they're kind of challenging. Because if everything happens for a reason, then you can take the pencil in the pew and stick it in the person alongside of you. When they yell, ouch, you can go, sorry, God will take care of it. And then you'll have to pick yourself up because they'll probably knock you down. Which wouldn't be what God's plan was. God's plan was for us to live in the garden. God's plan is for us to accept Christ and live in forgiveness. Amen.